As an American, there are few things I love more than talking about how America is the best country in the history of countries, especially when the quantitative evidence that supports this conclusion is an arbitrary number made up by, you guessed it, Americans. Which leads us to the topic of today's discussion, GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, which, put simply, is how much stuff any given region produces. These regions usually come in the form of countries, but can also be used to describe anything from cities to states to provinces to administrative districts, because everything in England has to have a fancy name. And beyond its original use as a stuffed measure, has come to secretly but not so secretly mean that your country's economy is better than another country's economy because numbers. Of course, on its own, despite placing America at the number one spot as it should be, GDP isn't entirely accurate because it fails to account for a few key factors, one of which would be the total population that makes up the region that you're measuring. This is where GDP per capita comes in, which is basically GDP divided by population. And you might notice that the numbers you get when calculating GDP per capita, if everything was done right, are actually not in billions or millions or trillions, but thousands of dollars. And this makes sense because GDP per capita indirectly shows you how much money each individual would have if the value of the amount of stuff a country produces was divided equally among the people who made said stuff. Now, thankfully, doing this once again puts the US above China where it rightfully belongs, but it also surprisingly puts it behind several unexpected countries such as Singapore, Qatar, Monaco, which all have one thing in common, that being that these countries are relatively small countries with a relatively high output of products, those being shipping, oil, and being rich. Now, what does all of this tell us? No, it's not that America's the best, even though it is, and no, it's not that Monaco's rich, even though it is. GDP on its own is really meant to show a general estimate of how much a country is producing overall, which is useful despite some claims of inaccuracy at showing the overall value of a country's economy in a more accurate measurement than they make a lot of stuff. GDP per capita, on the other hand, is meant to show a general estimate of how much a country's workers are each able to produce, which is useful, despite some claims of inaccuracy, at showing the overall productivity of a country's workforce in a more accurate measurement than they make a lot of stuff. And of course, unofficially, GDP is associated with the level of economic stability and influence a country has in the world, while GDP per capita, again, unofficially, shows the standard of living of the people in these countries. And that's about it.